Joan waited inside her cabin with her newborn baby Hannah. Outside and into the trees a short distance, Longleaf spoke with his wives, Gentlefern and Acorn. Their new life of peace had a shorter expiration date than they had imagined. Joan killed the search party for her from Whitby. With a few common known words and hand gestures, she was able to convey to Longleaf that more would be coming, and probably soon. Longleaf abandoned his tribe only a few weeks prior specifically to avoid war and keep his wives safe. He looked to the eyes of Gentlefern and Acorn. Their expressions pleaded with him silently. He had to look away from their gazes to even speak. "This is not our fight." Acorn sniffled a bit. "But she is the Chana," Gentlefern added, but with a little bit more umph. "This is different than the greed of tribes. This is protecting someone special." Longleaf looked to the cabin. Joan stood by the door now, holding Hannah, and he turned back and nodded to his wives. "We'll stay." Acorn and Gentlefern smiled, but only a few moments once the reality hit them that their decision meant violence and horrors of war were to be at their very feet. They wasted no time. They did not know if they had hours or days to prepare. Acorn and Gentlefern were taking branches and sharpening them into long spears. Meanwhile, Joan was teaching Longleaf how to operate the muskets. Joan knew the concept, and between the two of them, they figured it out. She left him 15 balls to practice with and then went to sit with Acorn and Gentlefern. She placed a stone in front of each of them, made them levitate, set them back down, and said, "You try." She said, "Look at them." She used 2 fingers to point to her eyes and then to the stones. "Look at them and connect with them." Every few minutes, the booming of the musket echoed into the woods, and Joan sat with them while the stone stayed completely still. "Keep trying." She was losing hope quickly. She could teach her magics to others, though. Longleaf rejoined with Joan as she was using her stone and sand-cutting technique into some trees, knocking them over. Once it fell, Longleaf would hack the branches off and hand them to his wives to sharpen. They had constructed hip-high barricades around the perimeter of the homestead. They were made out of the stacked logs. They had it all done by nightfall, thanks to Joan being able to move and stack them without even lifting a finger. The spiked spears were buried, pointy side out, to deter any horses or climbers. As they ate dinner that night, Joan continued to try and teach Acorn and Gentlefern the telekinesis. Everyone was distraught over the failures. Neither of them could do it. While they all ate dinner together, Joan heard Longleaf say a word in Chicoy to Acorn she had not learned yet. And then Acorn passed him their water skin, and he handed it back after a swig. Joan tilted her head and repeated the word she heard. "Tanma?" Longleaf handed Joan his bow and said, "Tanma," then gestured for it back and repeated, "Tanma." Then Acorn handed her the water skin and reached for it back. "Tanma," she said, helping in the lesson. Joan felt a spark in her imagination. Tanma means what? Borrow? She leaned back and continued to rock the sleeping Hannah in her arm. Borrow. I wonder, she thought to herself. The next morning, Joan woke up Acorn and handed her Hannah. Watch. Keep. Tanma. Acorn rubbed her eyes, nodding, and took Hannah. Then Joan went out the door with a fire in her step. She started rooting around her mushroom garden, touching and feeling, waiting to sense something that might help her. At the corner of the plot, finally a sensation of energy. She plucked the mushroom, and holding it in her hand, she lost the feeling. She put it down and placed her hand to the soil where it once was growing, and felt the energy again. She started digging. The more she dug, the more she felt the energy. First a few inches into the ground, then her wrist into the ground, and finally half her arm was into the earth before she felt it. Something hard and powerful. She dug around with her finger and pulled out a rock laced with quartz. She looked at it closely. The crystal-like rock was making her feel full of magics. With it laying in her palm, she made it levitate, using the magic she felt, fueling herself. But it was hard to do it. Joan tried harder. The quartz shook, hopped, but didn't levitate. She was getting frustrated and confused. She tried even harder. It made her head start to pound and her skin perspire all over. But the quartz did not levitate. Come on, she said to the stone over and over. And then it started glowing, shaking and rumbling in her palm. Come on, she barked at it, losing her temper. She yelled at it again. Come on, float. The quartz stopped moving and glowing, but all around her the dirt and mushrooms and leaves poofed up and popped into the air. She looked around. Branches, rocks, the barricades, All of it she could make levitate like normal. Why is this stone so different, she wondered. She looked at it again. Come on, float, she said softly, and once the words escaped her lips, the ground around her burst once again. She looked around curiously. Come on? She paused. Float? The ground spewed dirt and debris around her once again. She looked to a larger rock into the forest. Come on, float. And the rock lifted. She didn't feel like she was doing anything special. She was not influencing it like she normally does. A glance away made it fall. She stood and ran back to the cabin. She burst through the door, covered in dirt and sweat. She grabbed Gentle Fern's arm and yanked her, almost to the floor, trying to wake her up. Wake up, wake up! Gentle Fern followed along with confusion at the hyper Joan. Acorn followed with Hannah in her arms, curious of all the commotion Joan was causing. Joan pointed to the stones they were trying to lift the day prior. Gentle Fern sighed and grunted, too defeated to try again. Joan grabbed her shoulders and looked into her eyes. Hold this, hold this. She put the quartz stone into her hand and said, Come on, float. Gentle Fern looked at her, still confused. No, look at the stone and say, Come on, float. Gentle Fern then looked to Acorn for clarity. Acorn was just as perplexed. Joan said it again and again. Come on, float. Say it. Come on, float. Gentle Fern looked at the stone on the ground and held the quartz. She parted her lips, and they danced the words, Come on, float. The stone jumped into the air, and as Gentle Fern gasped, it fell again. Joan clapped and hugged her. Yes, again! Gentle Fern then looked to one of the spikes. Come on, float. The spike lifted from the dirt. Acorn was watching in wonder, and Gentle Fern was crying happy tears. Where her eyes went, the spike went. She looked at a tree and spoke again. Come on, float. The spike zipped into the tree, sticking out, lodged into its bark. Acorn quickly looked around to find an object to try. She settled on Longleaf's stone axe. Come on, float, she said excitedly. But nothing happened. She frowned. Joan took the quartz from Gentle Fern. Tanma! And then took Hannah from Acorn and gave her the quartz instead. Try again. Gentle Fern looked to the axe. Come on, float. The axe popped into the air and fell back down. Joan had created the world's first spell. She had pushed her magics into the quartz. It absorbed her powers, and like a password or trigger word, speaking the phrase spoken at the time of fusion allows the person holding it to use the energies inside. As Gentle Fern and Acorn took turns with the quartz, laughing and playing as they made all manner of objects around them float, Joan ran off in a hurry into the woods. She focused and walked slow, trying to sense more quartz. It only took about 20 minutes until she felt an energy at her feet. With one hand holding Hannah, she brushed the leaves away from the forest floor and dug out a new quartz. When Joan returned, she saw Longleaf was back from his scout and patrol, the musket in one hand and the quartz in the other. He was repeating over and over, Come on, float! Come on, float! Acorn and Gentle Fern took turns showing Longleaf, but any time he tried, he failed. Once Joan was there, she tried to teach him too, but it just did not work for Longleaf. She left the three of them and went inside to feed Hannah, who was getting quite hungry and grumpy now. Hannah ate well and fell back asleep for a morning nap. Acorn came in. Longleaf could still be heard outside. Come on, float! Joan wanted to try again. She wanted to make another spell quartz. How do you say fly? She made her arms into wings like a bird and flapped around. Fly, how do you say fly? Acorn softly spoke out, hesitant at what word she wanted. Nen? She said. Joan smiled. Good, okay. I need a word you can't say on accident, so let's combine our languages. Nen, fly. Joan sat, and just as she did earlier, she focused on the quartz in her hand and repeated, Nen, fly. Nen, fly. Nen, fly. Over and over. Just as she was pushing her magics into the quartz, she could feel it pulling just as much out of her. The quartz rumbled and glowed just as the first one did. It finally stopped, and Joan felt the connection cease. She handed it to Acorn. Try. Acorn looked at the pillow. Nenfly. The pillow hovered. It had worked again, and with a new word. She went outside the cabin, and Acorn immediately ran over, showing them her new quartz. Joan didn't really teach them magics, but she was happy she was able to find some other way to share. Suddenly, all four of them had their attention stolen at once, as deep in the forest a large flock of passenger pigeons took off into flight. Longleaf ran to the barricade that was facing the running flock and propped his musket on it. "Get down," he said in a harsh whisper. The three women ducked behind the cover as well. Joan looked up at Longleaf to see his eyes widen and face pale. She turned and peeked, and she saw 20 or so Whitby men with muskets approaching through the forest. They disappeared and reappeared as the massive flock of pigeons were starting to blot out the sun. The forest flickered between day and night as the large mass of birds took to the sky. Longleaf and Joan stayed peeking over their log barricades. They watched the sun lighten the woods, and for a few moments they could see most of the men were now taking aim. The forest dimmed again, and bright flashes from the muzzles firing lit up. The cabin and barricade popped and splintered as they were peppered with the lead balls. Hannah started screaming and crying from inside the cabin. Acorn was screaming just as much also. A break in the flock let the sun peek through once again. Longleaf slid his aim left and right, looking for the men who were nowhere to be seen. Then Gentle Fern peeked and saw a ramrod piston up and down behind a tree. She held her quartz and shouted, "Come on, float!" The tree the man was hiding behind shook and uprooted into the air, removing his cover. Longleaf yanked the trigger, and the confused and stunned Whitby resident that was standing in shock at the display had his chest burst into a red mist of chunks and gore as the large caliber ball hollowed him out. Longleaf frantically reloaded, and Acorn joined Gentle Fern. They yelled their spell commands out together. "Come on, float!" screamed Gentle Fern, lifting another tree. "Nen fly!" squealed Acorn, removing a tree of her own. Men scattered and ran as their hiding places were lifted, exposing them. Longleaf took another shot, and Joan lifted the spears, launching them as the men ran to hide behind different trees and cover. She pierced and skewered 6 in only a few seconds. Faces and muzzles peeked out again, and another rainfall of musket balls smashed into their cover. Longleaf had all 4 muskets staged and was passing them to Joan to reload after he took a shot each time. The Whitby residents were persistent, even as they watched the supernatural events of trees lifting and their friends shot and skewered. The hate in their hearts for Joan fueled their courage. Every time the sun blacked out from the still massive flock of pigeons, the men in the tree line would run up a little closer. Joan was even able to recognize most of them as they were so close now. The carpenter who helped build her well cover was now shooting at her. She didn't hesitate, though, even though she remembered how he did not charge her for the service. She sent a flying, sharpened stick through his face. Their ears all ringing from the gunshots, they could barely even communicate anymore. The forest beyond the homestead was thinning out as Acorn and Gentle Fern continued uprooting trees to remove the Whitby fighters' cover. Longleaf's shoulder was aching and black and blue from the recoil. He was riding such an adrenaline high that he hadn't even noticed that one of the shots had nicked the top of the log and splintered and buried dozens of little wood shrapnel pieces into his chest. Exhaustion was setting in to the 4 defenders, their bag of musket rounds almost empty, and Gentle Fern's quart seemed to be losing its effects, only making the trees shake now. The Whitby residents fought until only 3 remained before they turned and retreated. Joan stood with a weak stumble. As they fled, running for their lives, she tried to lift them. It didn't work. She couldn't tether her mind to the men for some reason. Still, she showed no mercy. She kicked up the dirt and debris of the forest around them and created a cyclone. Each had their own tornado spinning, driving and pelting tiny stones and soil, shredding them. It was literally death by 1,000 cuts. The peaceful silence of their forest returned, and the 4 stood and stared at the carnage they created. The pieces of men and their bodies strewn about, the holes from where trees once lived, and the musket smoke leaving a black fog to linger. Wives, mothers, and families waited and worried back at Whitby, but none of the 24-man search party was ever to return. The mayor of Whitby declared to the town that no other search parties were to be conducted. However, revenge was in the hearts of many residents still, and protest erupted for days. Rumors and legends flourished of Joan for years and years in Whitby, even making their way to Hartford. It was in Hartford that the mother of a sick child heard of a powerful witch. The doctors gave her little hope that her daughter would survive much longer, and with the mother's desperation to protect, she packed the horse and cart with supplies, carefully loaded her daughter, and she set off to find Joan the witch. Next episode, we will see how Joan forms a crusade of grandeur and turned respect into a religion.